government small in the mid-1950s and late 50s? Not if you were white, it wasn't. It was pretty small for everybody else. But for white folks, it was huge, and they had been for a very long time. I mean, we could actually go back to the colonial period to see how big the state intervention in the markets had always been for dominant groups. We don't go back that far. This isn't a history class. I'll just take you back to the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave out 245 million acres of essentially free land to white folks. People of color essentially completely excluded from that, all west of the Mississippi, or at least most of it. About 40 million white folks today still living on that land, or who have benefited directly from the intergenerational transfer of that land, and have reaped some type of economic reward for it. I haven't seen any of those 40 million white folks going to their congressperson or senator, tapping them on the shoulder in DC and saying, okay, here's the deal. I'm really embarrassed about this. Can we keep this between us? Shh. I've got this ranch. I've got this farm, house. Oh my God. It's been in my family for generations. They didn't really pay for it. I want to give it back to you. Don't make a big deal. Don't go to the press. I want this to be public knowledge that we've had this thing. And don't even pay me for it. I don't need my money for it. I just want to give it to you for a song, because after all, were I to keep this house that was given to my family by the government, that would be like, what's it called? That'd be like socialism. I love capitalism. See, that's what I'm all about. He will take it. I'm not suggesting white folks should do that. I know they're not going to do that. I'm just pointing out the inconsistency. So government had been big for a long time. It got even bigger in the 20th century with the FHA and the VA loan programs, and later with the very racially selective way in which the GI Bill was administered. The FHA gave out $120 billion worth of housing equity preferentially to white families between 34 and 62. Right? This was an FHA lending program without which the white middle class would never have existed. Because prior to the creation of that program under the Roosevelt administration during the New Deal, banks wouldn't lend money to working class people. Even if you were white, they didn't care. They weren't going to give money to poor and working class folks to get a house. They had too big a risk. The government comes in and says, don't worry, we'll assume some of the risk. We'll underwrite and guarantee the loans against default. They said, okay, great. So they opened up the coffers of money, $120 billion in housing equity. If we gave $120 billion of anything to people of color, 240 million acres of land to people of color, you know what we call that. We call that welfare. We call it a handout. We did it for white folks. We called it nation building. Good macroeconomic policies. So government was huge. 40% of all white mortgages held by 1960 were written under a government preferential program, without which those families wouldn't have had a house. So when this woman was saying, and when the Tea Party folks were saying, we want to go back to that era when government was small, they know not of what they speak. Government was huge. It had just started the Interstate Highway Program in 1956, which did what? Actually subsidized white flight. Made it easier, did it not, for white folks who lived in the cities to leave the cities and go to the suburbs where only they could live. At the very time, the government was collaborating federal, state, and local to actually destroy black and brown housing in urban areas under what was called urban renewal, which really meant black and brown folk removal, interstate highway construction through black and mostly at that time Puerto Rican neighborhoods. Right? By the time the late 1960s came around, 20%, 1 out of 5 of all residences lived in by African American folk in this country had been knocked to the ground to make way for interstates, shopping malls, parking lots, office parks. So the government was intervening to destroy black and brown housing at the very moment it's subsidizing white housing. How can we say government was small? It was huge. Now the question is, why do we remember it otherwise? Why do we think that this pre-1960s era is all about low taxes, small government, and self-help, and individualism, and individual initiative, and people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, as was referenced in the introduction? There's only one logical explanation for that. And that is that at the very moment people of color finally were able to gain access to some of the stuff white folks had already had access to for years, that's when the problem began. That's when we discovered our inner libertarian, and not 1 minute before. As long as there was only white folks getting the goodies from the New Deal, every white person who wasn't rich loved it. You will not find one average, everyday, workaday white person in the 30s who would say, let's just leave it to the private sector. Are you crazy? Nobody, no average, everyday white person would be like, you know what, I just think we ought to leave it up to the market. Don't create a job for me, government. That'll make me dependent and lazy. Nobody said that until the 60s come around and people of color start to get access to the same stuff white folks already had access to. Go back and read the legislative history of the Social Security Act of 1935. Go back and read the legislative comments made by the congresspersons on the floor of the United States Congress explaining why they were creating cash welfare. What was at that time called Aid to Dependent Children, later AFDC, now TANF. Right? Because we know what the rhetoric today is about cash support for single moms and kids, but what was the rhetoric then? See, this just lets you know the important factor is the changing complexion of the perceived recipients. Because back then, when only white folks really had access because of the way those rules were written state by state, and at the federal level, you know what the rhetoric was? These congresspeople got on the floor of the House and of the Senate, they said, we got to have cash support for these white widows whose husbands have died. And these white women whose husbands have left home looking for work in some other state during the Depression. We've got to be able to support them so that they can stay at home, raise their children, and not have to go work in the paid labor force. Wow. Now, putting aside the patriarchal assumptions of that, which is bad enough, put aside how sexist it is to suggest that women should not be in the paid labor force, they should be at home. Put that aside for just a second and ask yourself how different that rhetoric is from that which we hear today. Because if I'm not mistaken, today the rhetoric is the polar opposite. The rhetoric today is if you're receiving cash assistance, you are lazy and pathological and dysfunctional and a member of some ghetto underclass and you should get a job raising your children. What kind of nonsense is that? Apparently it was good enough for white women. The state created these programs intentionally to bring about dependence of white women on the state. But as soon as people of color gained access, oh my goodness, no, this is bad for children and families. We can't do this, you see. So I would suggest to you, think about this because it's the only way we can really understand this crazy, silly political season in which everyone is sort of assuming government intervention in the markets, government intervention on behalf of the have-nots is a bad thing. That was not the rhetoric 70 years ago. It wasn't even close. That's a very recent phenomenon, a very modern phenomenon, and it traces exactly one-to-one, almost to the minute, when people of color began to gain access to those programs. That is not a coincidence, you see. So you can say that you're against big government and you want low taxes, and I'm not going to say that your motivation is inherently racist as a result of that, but trust me when I tell you that if you came of age in this country in the last 40 years, it is impossible to disentangle those two narratives. The one that is about government size and taxation size, and the other which is about black and brown folk. Those two narratives have been inherently woven together for almost a half a century. You cannot tell me that somehow they are unique and independent of one another, because they aren't. So this narrative is what the right wants to control. They want to erase the role of race in their narrative, even though the role of race in their narrative has been central. Now here's the sad fact. In response to the manipulation of that white racial anxiety, using coded language, using dog whistles like low taxes and small government, and individual responsibility, never actually necessarily using terms that are overtly racist, but everyone knows what they mean. Unfortunately, in response, those on the nominally liberal left remain silent. At least silent insofar as one might otherwise call out what it really is. Because those on the liberal left are afraid, as Barack Obama in 2004 was afraid to acknowledge the truth about this country's ongoing racial division. So we talk about anything but race. We talk about health care, but we don't talk about racism within the health care delivery system. We talk about health care, universal coverage, all of which is very important. I don't know anyone on the left who doesn't support it. But we don't talk about the research now, over 100 studies in the last 10 years, all of which say what? Independent of your economic status, independent of whether you have health care coverage or not, independent of issues of access and affordability, black and brown folks are experiencing bodily health crises as a result of racism in their everyday lives. Over 100 studies, one of which published in the American Journal of Public Health in 1996, 8 years before Barack Obama gave that "We Are a United States of America" speech, 12 years before he was elected, on the part of people who believed it was an evidence of post-raciality in our country. And what did the study say? It said that the consequences, the effects of racism and discrimination against people of color have just as much of an impact on blood pressure and hypertension and the related health consequences of those things as high-salt diets, lack of exercise, and smoking. But now we have declared obesity and smoking, for instance, to be public health issues. We haven't done that with racism, even though the evidence suggests that it is, because we cannot speak these truths. When we ignore that truth, when we avoid mentioning race and calling out those who are deliberately exploiting racial fears, a few things happen. Number one, we can't solve the problem. You can't solve a problem that you will not name or call out. Colorblindness, as Julian Bond has reminded us, just leaves us blind to the consequences of color, making it impossible for us to actually address it. And the second thing is that ignoring the role of racism and discrimination in our everyday lives and our institutions enhances the denial on the part of white folks and even on the part of some folks of color that the problem is real. If you don't mention it, it must not be real. And God knows if the man of color in the White House doesn't mention it, lots of white folks say, well, then it can't be real. He's not talking about it, see? In fact, when they asked him, back a year or so ago when folks were marching around these rallies with signs picturing the president dressed like an African witch doctor with a bone through his nose. Oh, but that's not racist. No. That's just a sign. We didn't mean anything by it. We just thought it was funny. Just like that email we sent around with the White House lawn covered in watermelons. Now, that was just coincidental. We didn't mean anything by it. Right? And Jimmy Carter, former president, made the comment that had a little something to do with race. And they asked President Obama whether he agreed, and he backed off and said, oh no, I'm sure they're just anxious about the economy. Now, we are all anxious about the economy, but I don't remember ever being so anxious that I thought to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get a piece of poster board, and I'm going to put a picture of the president dressed like an African witch doctor with a bone through his nose, because that might help me find a job. The president had to dissemble, the president had to prevaricate, the president had to deceive, because his political career, at least he believes, is dependent on that lie. If you want to know how not post-racial we are, that's all you need to know. Because if we were post-racial, this man could tell the truth and nobody could touch it precisely, because he can be touched and politically destroyed, or at least feels he can be, and he remains silent. But the problem is we then play the same game. The president's going to do whatever he's going to do, but we do not have to play by those rules. We are not running for office. We do not hold office. We do not have to cater to the whims of certain voters who do not want to face this subject. We have to be braver, because when we don't talk about it, we cede the racial narrative to the right. They intend to use race against us. Make no mistake, they intend to use race and racism against even the mildest of progressive reforms. And if you don't believe me, all I have to do is look at what Glenn Beck said about the health care bill. I was at home a year and a half ago, late summer, and I'm watching television, I'm flipping around channels. I come across the Glenn Beck show, and for reasons that utterly escape me, I did not change the channel. I have a long-standing thing that I love circuses and carnivals and train wrecks, other moments of chaos. So I watched it, and I'm actually glad I did, because it was very informative. He looked right into the camera, and I was so sucked in. He was like, "He's talking to me." I want to know what this healthcare thing is all about, friends. So he called me a friend. I'm like, yes, I do. Please tell me, Lynn. Please tell me. See, I had a thought. I sort of thought I knew, like, what's the healthcare thing about? I'm thinking, healthcare? Apparently, one would only think that if one were an idiot, because Glenn has superior knowledge, and he explained it. He said, it's not about healthcare. I'm like, oh. Well, it was. Silly me. What is it, Glenn? He said, I'm going to tell you what it's about. It's really about this administration just trying to get reparations for slavery. Didn't see that coming, really. That one, even in the pantheon of asininity that has made up this man's entire career, that one was something special. And see, but here's the thing, here's the danger that we sometimes fall into, right, is we try to think this stuff through intellectually. We try to make sense of it analytically. Big mistake. Because intellectually, it's absurd, right? I mean, what is it? Does he really think, like, what kind of reparations is it that you got to get sick first to get paid? What kind of scam is that? Like, does he really think that black folks are sitting around going, I've got to figure out how to get this money? How am I going to get this money? How am I going to get this 40 acres and a mule? Oh. Hold up, I've got it! I know the plan now. I got to call all my friends. I get on the phone, call all their other black friends. I got a scam. I got a scheme. You want to know how we're going to get paid? You want to know how we're going to get our 40 acres and a mule? I've got it. What is it? What is it?